Welcome to Life Stories, where the unexpected journeys of ordinary people unfold in extraordinary ways. In today's story, we meet Caroline Thomas, a librarian by day and a global financial mogul by night. For years, she has carefully hidden her true identity from her family and the world. But when the time comes, she reveals her secret empire, challenging everyone's assumptions about success. Join us as we explore how Caroline turned knowledge into power and showed that sometimes the most remarkable people are the ones you least expect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story. It had always been a peculiar contrast, the way I led my life and the way my family perceived it. The library, with its towering shelves and the smell of old leather-bound books, was my world. It had always been this way. To my family, however, I was the one who had taken a wrong turn, the one who had chosen the quiet, seemingly inconspicuous life of a librarian while they carved out their paths in the world of business, wealth, and social prominence. My name is Caroline Thomas, and at 34, I had become the head librarian at the City Central Library. It wasn't exactly the job my parents had envisioned for their daughter. My mother, a graceful and poised woman of considerable influence in our community, had always dreamed that I would take my place beside her at society's most exclusive events, greeting fellow high society members with warmth and charm. She had hoped that I would walk in the footsteps of my brother, Thomas, whose name had become synonymous with success in our family's business empire. But I had chosen a different path, one that both puzzled and, at times, frustrated them. It wasn't just a job for me, though. The library was not a cage, it was a sanctuary. Books were my refuge. They were where I found meaning, where I discovered the wisdom of ages past, where I understood human nature in its complexity. I loved it, every dusty corner, every quiet moment spent with a leather-bound volume, every little piece of forgotten knowledge that could be preserved for future generations. But it was also the perfect cover for the life I led in secret. A life that no one in my family had any inkling of. While they saw me as someone who had failed to meet their expectations, someone who had squandered her potential, they didn't know what I had been quietly building over the last 7 years. Beneath the facade of a librarian was something far more powerful. A global financial empire, Summit Global Partners. I had spent the better part of a decade building it, one discrete deal at a time, leveraging knowledge and information in ways that no one could have imagined. It was the culmination of all I had learned in my quiet, unnoticed career. The library had provided not just a home, but a strategic position for me to understand and navigate the world of global finance. No one would ever suspect the librarian of being the mastermind behind some of the largest deals in private equity. Yet here I was. It was a Wednesday morning when I first saw him again, after several months of strained encounters. My brother, Thomas, walked into the rare book section of the library where I was lost in the pages of an old, leather-bound volume. I didn't hear him approach until his voice broke through the stillness. "Don't you get tired of wasting your life?" Thomas's voice was sharp, laced with a mix of annoyance and a hint of superiority. As always, I didn't look up immediately. His presence was expected. He had always been a part of the narrative of my life, one that I could neither escape nor ignore. I slowly placed the book back in its protective case, my fingers lingering for just a moment longer, feeling the weight of its ancient wisdom. I glanced up to see him leaning casually against a bookshelf, his designer suit in stark contrast to my modest librarian's attire. His smirk was unchanged since childhood, a familiar expression of someone who believed they had already won, someone who never quite understood the value of patience and discretion. "Hello, Thomas," I said calmly, keeping my voice steady as I stood up. I carefully adjusted my glasses, meeting his gaze with quiet composure. "I hadn't expected to see him here, of all places. I didn't expect you to come by. Mom sent me," he replied, his eyes scanning the room in distaste as if the library itself offended his senses. "She wants to make sure you're not going to embarrass us at their anniversary party tonight." I nodded, suppressing a sigh. I knew exactly where this was heading. His words always carried an edge of condescension. but I had grown used to them over the years. He continued, his voice dripping with disdain as he glanced around the library. Though I suppose it's too late for that. A librarian in the family. Dad's still trying to explain that one to his golf buddies. A familiar pang of frustration welled up inside me. But I kept my expression neutral. I had heard it all before. My family, with their old money sensibilities, could never quite understand why I had chosen this life. Why I had turned my back on the world of high society and wealth that they held in such high regard. My name is Caroline Thomas, I replied softly, as if reminding him of the fact he so often preferred to overlook. Not the family disappointment, as you like to call me. I could tell by the flicker in his eyes that he was about to say something else. To continue his tirade about the uselessness of my chosen career. But I wasn't interested in engaging with him on that level today. I had long since learned that it was futile to argue with someone who had already made up their mind about you. I'll be there, I assured him, standing tall, even though I knew he still towered over me in both height and status. And I'll dress appropriately, Thomas. You needn't worry about that. His smirk widened, but he didn't say anything more. He straightened the Rolex on his wrist, his eyes gleaming with the same smug satisfaction that had always accompanied his success. It's an important night, he added. I'm announcing some big news tonight. Bought my third company this year. Morgan Industries is officially a conglomerate now. Dad's going to be so proud. I nodded, keeping my face neutral as I suppressed the tightening of my hands. Inside, I felt a surge of emotion. But I buried it. He didn't need to know how I felt about his latest triumph. He would never understand what it took to build something from nothing. Not the way I had. That's wonderful, I said softly, my voice betraying none of the bitterness that I felt. Congratulations, Thomas. He barely acknowledged my words. Already turning to leave, his mind focused entirely on his own success. You know, he added over his shoulder. There's still time for you to join the real world. I could use someone to manage our corporate library. At least then you'd be doing something useful with all that knowledge. His words stung, more than I cared to admit. But I didn't let it show. Instead, I smiled, thinking of the encrypted laptop hidden in my office safe. Of the meetings I'd taken under an alias. Of the work I had been doing in the shadows. I was more than just a librarian. But that was a secret I intended to keep for a little longer. I'm happy where I am, I said, my voice unwavering. He shrugged dismissively, already turning away. Your loss, he muttered before disappearing out the door. As the sound of his footsteps faded, I allowed myself a brief moment to exhale. The weight of his words hung in the air. But it no longer mattered. My life, my empire, was something he would never understand. And that was just fine. I waited 5 minutes before heading to my office. The space was small, almost unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what lay behind its walls. But to me, it was perfect. It had served as both my home and my headquarters. A place where I could be both the librarian they thought I was and the businesswoman I had become. I locked the door behind me and booted up my laptop, logging into a secure server. 3 windows popped up immediately. There were video calls waiting from Tokyo, London, and New York. As I greeted my team and discussed the day's business, I couldn't help but smile. They had no idea that in a few hours, everything would change, and neither did my family. For now, I was still their bookish daughter, hidden among the books. But the world was about to see who I really was. The evening unfolded as I had expected. The anniversary party was nothing new. My family's estate was lit up like a stage. Its grandeur a testament to the wealth and status that they had cultivated over the years. Guests arrived in their luxury cars, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, the kind of vehicles that made even the most modest Audi seem insignificant. The air was thick with the subtle clink of crystal glasses, the rustle of expensive fabrics, and the hum of carefully curated conversations. As I parked my car, an Audi I'd chosen for its modesty, just enough to avoid drawing attention to myself, I could already hear the murmurs of the party drifting through the open windows. The scent of fresh-cut flowers mingled with the smell of polished wood and leather as I walked up to the grand entrance of the house. "Miss Thomas, the family is waiting for you," the butler, Mr. Jenkins, said as he opened the door. His expression was unreadable, but I could tell he was used to me by now. And the polite distance he kept said everything. He knew who I was. Yet somehow, he also knew there was more to me than just the quiet librarian they saw me as. "Thank you, Jenkins," I replied, my tone as calm as ever. It was as if the words had already been practiced, though they came naturally now. I stepped into the main hall, where my parents and their guests mingled. A soft symphony of laughter and polite chatter in the background. My mother's voice rang out across the room, carrying an air of forced warmth. "Caroline, darling, you look presentable," she said, her approval laced with a hint of condescension. The word, presentable, coming from her was high praise, though I knew it was the best I could expect from her. Elizabeth Thomas had never forgiven me for choosing a life among books instead of among the powerful circles of wealth and business. Yet, she never failed to ensure I was well placed in her world, physically. At least, I kissed her cheek, as I always did, greeting her with the same formal affection. "Happy anniversary, Mom. You look beautiful," she beamed, though her eyes flickered to the other guests already gossiping behind her back. It was hard to believe that this was the woman who had always looked down on me for my choices. Still, the ties of family ran deep. And it was in moments like this that I realized the complexities of love. They loved me, but only in the ways that suited them. I could only ever be the daughter who hadn't failed them, not the one who had succeeded on her own terms. "I'm so glad you could join us," she continued, her voice shifting in pitch as she turned to scan the room for more important guests. She was already forgetting me, moving on to the next interaction. I didn't mind. I was used to it. My father's booming voice broke through the background noise. "There's my girl." His affection was loud and brash. Just like him, but it was always welcome. I made my way over to where he stood, surrounded by his usual crowd of golf buddies and business associates. His laughter echoed around us as I submitted to one of his customary bear hugs. "Still working with those books?" Harold Prescott, one of Dad's longtime business partners, asked, his tone dripping with an almost dismissive curiosity. "Still working with those books," I confirmed, not missing a beat. "Someone has to preserve knowledge for the next generation." They all chuckled indulgently, the kind of laugh that one would use when humoring an eccentric. An indulgence made more out of tradition than true understanding. As I turned to leave the group, the door to the party opened, and in strode my brother, Thomas, looking every bit the part of the golden child. A sharp suit, his Rolex gleaming in the soft light. He was the picture of success. He strode across the room with the practiced ease of a man who had always been the center of attention. "I'd like to make an announcement," Thomas declared, raising a glass in one hand. The room fell silent as he played to his audience, and I couldn't help but notice the sharp edge in his voice. It was a moment he had been waiting for, a moment to prove to the world, and to me, that he had always been the superior sibling. "Today, I'm proud to announce that we're on the verge of our biggest acquisition yet," he said, pausing for effect. "By this time next week, we'll own Nakamura Tech." The room erupted in applause, and my parents' faces lit up with pride. Their eyes sparkled with admiration, and I could feel the heat of their approval on my skin. It was a moment that belonged to Thomas, and he thrived in it. But it didn't matter to me. I knew the truth. The reality of the deal that he was so certain of. I had seen it unfold from the shadows, quietly orchestrated by me, though Thomas had no idea. I raised my glass in a small, deliberate gesture of acknowledgement, but I said nothing. He didn't need my congratulations, he had never needed them. And frankly, he wasn't going to get them tonight. As he basked in the praise, his eyes finally turned to me. "What do you think, little sister?" His voice was thick with condescension, the challenge in his tone unmistakable. "Ready to admit you backed the wrong horse?" I met his gaze evenly, not allowing myself to flinch. "I think," I said slowly, You shouldn't count your chickens before they hatch. Thomas laughed, the sound mocking. Always so cautious. Jules, he taunted. That's why you'll never be more than what you are. Hiding in your library while the rest of us build empires. I smiled thinly, my words measured. Perhaps. But at least I understand the value of due diligence. His expression shifted slightly, the smugness faltering for a moment as he processed what I had said. But before he could respond, Mom called everyone to dinner. And the conversation moved on. As I sat down at the dinner table, I could feel the weight of the evening pressing on me. The compliments, the subtle insults, the endless questions about my so-called career choices, they all blended into a blur of disconnection. Dinner would be no different than any other event. My family would never understand. But that night, they would learn just how wrong they had been. And by tomorrow morning, they would have no choice but to confront the truth. The next morning came with a sense of quiet determination. As the sun rose over the city, I was already heading toward the library, dressed in my usual professional attire. It had been a strange sensation, stepping out of my apartment that morning, knowing that the world was about to see what I had been hiding for 7 years. But still carrying myself as the librarian I had always been. The city felt the same as it always had. But I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The library, with its marble floors and towering bookshelves, was my sanctuary. I walked through its halls as I always did, nodding to the regulars who came in each morning to read their newspapers or sift through the latest research. They knew me as the calm, quiet librarian who kept the institution running smoothly. None of them knew what I had been up to behind the scenes. No one ever questioned why I kept such strict hours, why I was always present when the doors opened and closed. It was my way of maintaining the perfect cover. A routine so flawless that no one would ever suspect that I was secretly running a multi-billion-dollar company from the very office they thought was just my workspace. At exactly 8 a.m., I arrived at my office. The small, unassuming room that had become the headquarters for my clandestine operations. There, waiting for me, was Sarah, my assistant. She was the only one in the world who knew the full extent of my double life. To the world, she was simply my assistant librarian, a pleasant woman with a warm smile and an unflappable demeanor. But outside the library's walls, Sarah was the chief operating officer of Summit Global Partners. She was brilliant, sharp, and loyal, a key player in the empire I had built. Everything's ready, Sarah said quietly, her voice calm but with a hint of anticipation. She handed me a tablet with the morning's schedule. The deal we had worked on for months, the Nakamura Tech acquisition, was now about to be finalized. The press release was set to go out at 9 a.m. sharp. There was no turning back now. I glanced at the screen, seeing the familiar names of legal teams in Tokyo, London, and New York. The documents were ready, the final signatures just moments away. I could feel the weight of the moment settling on my shoulders. But I refused to let it show. This was the culmination of years of work, and the world would finally know the truth. How's the media prep? I asked Sarah, as I powered up my laptop. All set. The press release is scheduled. The team is standing by for the next phase, she said, her tone even and focused. She was a professional through and through. Someone who had always known how to keep things moving forward. I took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment when everything I had worked for, every sacrifice, every secret, would come to light. But I had prepared for this day for so long. The foundation was solid. The media was already poised to deliver the story across multiple platforms. I wasn't just a librarian. I was a force in global finance. Let's give it a few more minutes, I said, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I glanced at the clock on my desk. The world would soon know about Summit Global Partners. As the minutes ticked down, I could feel a wave of excitement building within me. It wasn't just the thrill of success that spurred me on. It was the deep satisfaction of proving to myself, and to my family, that I was not the failure they had always believed me to be. At precisely 8:55 a.m., my private line rang. It was Mr. Nakamura's translator, confirming that the deal was ready to be finalized. I smiled. my calm exterior never faltering. "Let's proceed," I said simply. The next few minutes were a blur of signatures, confirmations, and the swift clicking of keys. By 9 a.m., Summit Global Partners officially owned Nakamura Tech, along with all its subsidiaries, patents, and cutting-edge technology. The deal had been finalized. Sarah checked the time, her eyes flicking to her tablet. "The press release is live," she said. I opened several news websites on my screen, watching as the story broke across multiple platforms. The headlines were already flooding in. Mystery buyer acquires Nakamura Tech. Global finance giant Summit Global Partners reveals identity of founder. And Wall Street stunned by library science expert turned business mogul. The world had just been introduced to the quiet librarian they had all underestimated. And my family? They would soon learn the truth, whether they liked it or not. As I closed my laptop and prepared to head out to my next meeting, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was more than just a business deal. It was the beginning of something far greater, something my family would never see coming. The world might have underestimated me, but I had spent years building a legacy that would speak for itself. I stood up from my desk, taking one last look at the quiet library around me. It was still the same space where I had spent countless hours among books. But now, it was also the starting point of a global empire. It was the perfect blend of the old and the new, the secret and the visible. And just like that, my life, my true life, had finally begun to take its place in the world. By the time the day drew to a close, I could feel the weight of the world shifting. The press had already spread the news. The story was everywhere, and my family? They were still reeling from the shock, though they hadn't yet grasped the full extent of what had just happened. I had no doubt that they would be calling soon. It was only a matter of time before their reality crumbled under the weight of the truth. As the evening approached, I received a message from my mother. "Are you going to come home tonight?" It was a simple question, yet I knew what she meant. The world was turning on its axis, and their carefully crafted image of who I was had been shattered. But I wasn't worried. This was the moment I had been waiting for. It was time to face them, to confront their assumptions and their prejudice. They had underestimated me for far too long. At 7 p.m., they arrived at my penthouse, and their reactions were everything I had expected: shock, disbelief, anger, and, eventually, respect. The dinner was a mixture of strained silence, questions, and moments of understanding. But by the end of the night, I had done what I set out to do. My father, who had always favored Thomas, finally saw me, not just as his bookish daughter, but as a woman who had built something real, something powerful. My mother, too, seemed to understand, though her pride was tempered by a reluctant admiration. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests left, I stood at the window, watching the city lights twinkle below. The empire I had created in secret had finally been revealed, and the world was taking notice. I was no longer just the quiet librarian. I was Caroline Thomas, the billionaire, the business mogul, the woman who had proven that success doesn't always wear a suit and tie. Thank you for following this journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for future life stories videos.